Imagine a disease so fast and so terrifying, it could kill you in the time it takes to watch a movie. You could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. This was the horrifying reality of the English sweat, a mysterious plague that appeared with the Tudor Dynasty and haunted England's most powerful family. So how did this bizarre illness kill with such incredible speed? And why did it just vanish? History is filled with terrifying diseases, but few have ever inspired the same kind of raw, primal fear as the English sweating sickness. It wasn't the Black Death, a horror people in the 15th and 16th centuries knew all too well. This was something new, something alien. It was a whisper that became a whirlwind of death, leaving entire towns desolate. As the English chronicler Edward Hall wrote, "This malady was so cruel that it killed some within 3 hours, some within 2 hours, some merry at dinner and dead at supper." Its scientific name, Tudor Anglicus, or the English sweat, hints at its strange and stubborn loyalty to one nation. For the most part, this was a plague with an English passport. It crashed down in 5 terrifying waves, starting in 1485 and ending abruptly in 1551. Its timeline is tied forever to one of England's most famous dynasties, the Tudors. It showed up the moment the first Tudor king took the throne and disappeared just as their power was being solidified. This link wasn't lost on people at the time. In an age drenched in superstition, the arrival of a new king and a new monstrous disease felt like a dark omen, a divine judgment written in sweat and fear. It stalked the halls of power, threatening nobles, courtiers, and even the king himself. It reached into the heart of the royal family, helping to shape the line of succession and fueling the paranoia of a monarch who lived in constant fear of his own death. This is the story of a 500-year-old medical cold case, a whodunit where the killer was invisible, the methods were brutally efficient, and the motives are still a mystery. What really was the English sweat, and could it ever come back? The year is 1485. England is exhausted, scarred by decades of the Wars of the Roses. But on the 22nd of August, on a field near Market Bosworth, the final chapter was written. Richard III was slain, and a Welsh nobleman with a shaky claim to the throne was crowned King Henry VII. As he marched to London to establish the Tudor Dynasty, his army brought an unseen and unwelcome guest. Some historians think Henry's own mercenary soldiers brought the disease from France. Another theory suggests it may have hit the city of York a few months earlier, before Henry's army even landed. Whatever its origin, when it hit London that September, it struck with the force of an invading army. This wasn't the plague. Londoners knew the plague, its grotesque sores and blackened skin. This new terror was different. It was faster. It started with a feeling of dread, a strange sense that something was terribly wrong. Then came a violent, bone-shaking chill, followed by excruciating pain in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. Then, the cold stage gave way to a raging heat and a torrent of sweat. It poured from the body, drenching clothes and bedding in a foul-smelling flood. Its speed was the most terrifying part. A person could be perfectly healthy one moment, only to be struck down and dead within hours. The first epidemic was devastating. In a city of about 50,000 people, the sweat claimed an estimated 15,000 lives in just 6 weeks, around 30% of the city's population. The city was torn apart. It killed without discrimination, taking 2 Lord Mayors of London, 6 aldermen, and 3 sheriffs one after another. An eyewitness physician, Thomas Le Forestier, wrote of the chaos. We saw 2 presties standing together and speaking together, and we saw both of them die suddenly. The coronation of Henry VII had to be postponed. The celebrations were quiet, overshadowed by the stench of death. For the average person, the connection was obvious. A new dynasty had arrived, and with it, a new plague. It seemed like a curse on the new Tudor rose. As winter came and the first wave subsided, a question hung in the London fog. What was this thing, and when would it return? They wouldn't have to wait long. The sweat would be back in 1507, 1517, 1528, and 1551. So what was it actually like to get the sweat? The most detailed account we have comes from an English physician named John Caius, who saw the final 1551 outbreak firsthand and wrote the only dedicated medical book on it. Caius documented the stages of the illness, painting a horrifying picture. It all began, he wrote, with a sense of apprehension. Victims described a sudden, inexplicable dread, a premonition that something awful was about to happen. This was immediately followed by a violent cold stage. This wasn't just the shivers. It was an intense, convulsive cold that could last for up to 3 hours, accompanied by a splitting headache and agonizing pains in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. Then, like a switch being flipped, the hot and sweating stage began. Caius described how the sweat would break out suddenly, without any obvious cause. It was a profuse, drenching sweat that soaked everything, accompanied by a foul odor, a burning heat, a rapid pulse, and an agonizing thirst. A physician from the first outbreak noted that in the final hours, loathsome vapors seemed to gather around the heart and lungs, causing sudden breathlessness. But the most terrifying symptom came last. As the body became exhausted and dehydrated, the victim was hit with an overwhelming urge to sleep. This wasn't a restful sleep. It was a heavy, oppressive stupor. John Caius believed that to give in to this sleep was to die. He urged attendants to do anything to keep the patient awake. Imagine it. Your body is screaming for rest after hours of agony, but the one thing you crave most is the very thing that will kill you. The entire process, from the first shiver to the final breath, was brutally fast, typically taking place within 24 hours. If a patient made it past that first day, they were likely to recover. What made the sweat even more baffling were the things it didn't do. Unlike the plague or smallpox, there was no telltale rash or sores. A person could look perfectly healthy one moment and be dying the next, and surviving an attack gave you no immunity. Some unlucky people caught it multiple times. Even the great Cardinal Thomas Wolsey got it several times and was considered incredibly lucky to have survived. It was also a summer disease, almost always appearing in the warmer months and vanishing in the cold. And strangest of all, it seemed to prefer the English. Foreign ambassadors in London noted with shock that while the English were dying in droves, they remained untouched. When the illness hit the English-held town of Calais, it ravaged the English, but didn't cross into France. It was as if the disease could read a person's nationality. The year was 1491. England was not long past the Wars of the Roses, and Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, sat upon a throne still unsteady. His crown was new, his authority not yet secure, and the land was uneasy. The nobles eyed one another with suspicion. The common folk still remembered the bloodshed, and the merchants worried about the shifting winds of trade. It was into this tense and fragile moment that the strange and terrifying new disease first appeared. The malady would soon be known as the sweating sickness. To later generations, it would be remembered with a shudder, for it struck suddenly, raged with violence, and killed with bewildering speed. Yet in that first outbreak, no one knew what to call it or how to respond. The earliest accounts came not from physicians, but from the fearful murmurings of neighbors and parish priests, who watched their congregants collapse and die within the span of a single day. The symptoms seemed at first almost like a feverish chill. A man would wake feeling uneasy, his head aching, his stomach unsettled. He might feel a sudden shiver, as though a cold wind had passed over him, though the summer air was still. Within hours, however, the body would begin to sweat. Not the gentle perspiration of exertion, but a violent pouring of fluids, drenching the skin and soaking the bedclothes. The sweat carried with it an odor that witnesses described as foul and unnatural, though it is difficult to know what exactly they meant, for such impressions were colored by fear. After the sweat began, weakness followed. The victim grew dizzy, his heart pounding and irregular. Breathing became labored, as if the air itself were too heavy to draw into the lungs. Some would grow delirious, speaking incoherently, or collapsing into a stupor. Within 3 or 4 hours, many were already near death. By the end of a single day, they were gone. This was the horror of the sweating sickness. Not merely that it killed, but that it killed so quickly. Other plagues of Europe, whether the great pestilence of the 14th century or the recurring outbreaks of plague that followed, moved more slowly. There was time to prepare, to flee, to pray. With the sweat there was only the morning of health and the evening of death. The people of London were the first to suffer. Reports tell of entire households struck down, of servants collapsing at their work, of noblemen carried from the court to their graves within hours. The disease did not spread as widely as plague, nor did it seem to linger long in the same place. Yet its speed gave it a fearsome reputation. Many who survived an outbreak swore that they had watched men die in less than half a day. King Henry himself was alarmed. Only recently crowned, he could not afford to lose the loyalty of his people or his court to terror. Physicians were summoned, prayers were offered, and proclamations were made urging calm. Yet what could medicine accomplish against a disease whose nature no one understood? Some thought it a poison carried in the air, perhaps born of foul mists from marshes. Others blamed foreign merchants, suggesting the illness had been brought across the sea. Still others whispered that it was a punishment from God, sent to remind England that peace was fragile and sin widespread. The social order of the city began to shift under the weight of fear. The poor, who lived in crowded lanes and narrow dwellings, were especially vulnerable. Their neighbors often shunned them, leaving the sick untended. Priests found themselves called to more funerals than they could count, and bells tolled endlessly in certain parishes. Yet, curiously, the sweating sickness did not always linger among the poor alone. Unlike the plague, which struck with particular cruelty at crowded tenements, the sweat often seemed to spare no one. Merchants, gentlemen, and even courtiers fell victim. Indeed, one of the strange features most remarked upon was its partiality for men in the prime of life. Strong young adults, who might have withstood other diseases, were cut down swiftly. Women and children were not exempt, but it was the deaths of vigorous men that most unsettled contemporaries. Here was a sickness that ignored the usual patterns, claiming the very strength of the nation. Day by day, fear spread. Streets emptied as people fled the city, seeking refuge in the countryside. Inns and wayhouses filled with travelers, many of them unknowingly carrying the infection with them. Villages that had never heard of sweating sickness soon found it at their doorsteps. In some places it lasted no more than a few weeks, then vanished as quickly as it had come. In others it left a longer trail of grief, but always it disappeared suddenly, leaving behind survivors who wondered whether it had been real at all, or some dreadful vision. Yet the memory did not fade quickly. Chroniclers of the time noted with unease the strangeness of this new disease. Was it a new kind of pestilence altogether, unlike anything seen before? Or was it an old malady returning in a new guise? Medieval medicine, bound by theories of humors and miasmas, struggled to account for it. Physicians advised purging, bleeding, and herbs to cool the body, yet many patients died despite treatment. Others survived with no aid at all, leading some to conclude that healing was entirely a matter of divine will. By the end of that first year, the outbreak had ebbed. The city resumed its life. Merchants returned to their stalls, and the court resumed its ceremonies. Yet the shadow of the sweat lingered in the mind of every survivor. They had seen how swiftly life could be taken, how powerless even the rich and mighty were before a sudden, invisible foe. For Henry Tudor, the new king, the episode was both a trial and a lesson. He had survived the disease himself, though rumors spread that even members of his household had perished. The experience reinforced the precariousness of his throne. If he could be swept away in a day, what would become of the realm? Thus, the sweat did not merely bring terror to households. It also shaped the politics of the age, reminding ruler and ruled alike that stability was fragile, and that death could arrive on any morning's breath. As the first great sweating came to a close, no one imagined it would return again and again across the 16th century. No one guessed it would terrify the courts of Henry VIII, trouble the reign of Edward, and spread even into foreign lands. For the moment, England breathed a sigh of relief and tried to forget, but the sweat was not done with them, not by far. The chronicles preserved from that year speak of people who felt they had lived through a vision of the end of days. They described neighbors collapsing, bells tolling without cease, and the fear that seized every heart when the first chill swept over the body. They spoke too of the strange suddenness with which the disease vanished, leaving behind nothing but memories, graves, and an enduring dread. It is in those accounts, scattered among the records of kings and the registers of parishes, that we can glimpse the first great sweating, not as a mere medical puzzle, but as a human event, a terror that stalked through streets and across fields, that altered the course of lives and the thoughts of a nation. This was the beginning of a story that would trouble England for decades to come. And so the English sweat entered history, a new and monstrous illness, swift as lightning, cruel as war, and mysterious as the will of the heavens. It would return, and each time it did, the fear would be greater, the questions sharper, and the memories darker. The Tudor Dynasty had only just begun its reign, but already it faced a foe that neither crown nor church nor physician could conquer. The summer sun of the year 1492 rose upon an England that wished for peace. The kingdom had been restless for too many decades. Civil war had torn apart noble families and unsettled towns. Henry Tudor, who had become Henry VII by victory at Bosworth, sought to weave unity where there had only been division. He rebuilt royal authority with careful attention and strict economy. He made treaties, arranged marriages, and demanded loyalty. Yet beyond his calculations lay an enemy that no bargain or sword could deter. The sweating sickness had struck once, but already it whispered its promise of return. In the minds of Londoners, every sudden chill and every night's sweat became a warning sign. Though the first outbreak had seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it had appeared, its memory lingered like smoke after a fire. Men and women told stories in taverns and around hearths of neighbors who had been healthy in the morning and laid out for burial before the evening bell. Such tales were repeated with growing vividness, embroidered with details of horror, until they became part of the collective imagination of the kingdom. Travelers carried the memory of the sweat into the countryside. Merchants from the city spoke of it in markets. Pilgrims repeated stories at shrines. Priests who had ministered to the dying reminded their flocks of the suddenness of God's judgments. A farmer in Kent or a fisherman in Devon, who had never seen the sweat in his own parish, could nonetheless recount its symptoms with chilling accuracy, for such was the power of rumor in an age when news was passed from lip to ear rather than from page to page. The disease did not rest. In the years that followed, it flared again in scattered towns. At times it appeared in the north, at times in the Midlands, and once more in the capital. Each outbreak confirmed that the sweat had not been a strange one-time visitation but a recurring plague. Its pace and pattern confused observers. Unlike the plague, which often traveled slowly from house to house or village to village, the sweat seemed to appear abruptly, strike fiercely, and then vanish. This unpredictability magnified the fear. One never knew if tomorrow the malady might not be waiting at one's own door. As the sweat spread its shadow, physicians wrote more careful notes. Their records were not systematic by modern standards, but they reveal the confusion of learned men who tried to explain what they saw. Some believed the sickness arose from bad air, from mists rising out of marshes, or from foul winds blowing from the continent. Others thought it bred within the body itself. A corruption of humor is made worse by rich foods, by idleness, or by sudden exertion. Remedies were prescribed: bleeding to reduce the heat, purging to drive out poison, and special diets to restore balance. Yet many patients who followed these regimens died as swiftly as those who took no treatment at all. There were stories of households where entire families perished within days, leaving only shuttered homes and silent hearths. There were villages where the churchyard filled so quickly that graves were dug in haste, bodies wrapped in sheets rather than coffins. In towns, the bells tolled until they became a part of the very air, a constant reminder of mortality. Children grew quiet, watching their parents fear. Servants fled from masters. In some places, strangers were met with suspicion, as though every traveler might carry the unseen doom. The court itself lived in dread. Henry Tudor understood the danger that the sweat posed to his fragile rule. A single outbreak within the palace could strike down not only servants and courtiers but the king himself. When rumors of illness arose, the court often moved into the countryside, seeking purer air and safer ground. Nobles built or maintained country houses not only for pleasure but as refuges against pestilence. The rhythms of politics were reshaped by the constant threat of disease. The sweat struck with particular cruelty among those who lived in close company. Universities, monasteries, and barracks were vulnerable. At Oxford, records tell of students dismissed from their halls as sickness swept through, lectures suspended, and scholars dispersed. At Cambridge, the same fears haunted masters and pupils alike. Monks who prayed together and ate together found their cloisters threatened, their chants interrupted by the sound of coughing and the labored breath of the dying. Chroniclers of the time did not merely describe symptoms, they recorded the atmosphere of dread. One compared the sickness to a sudden storm at sea, where the calm water turns violent in moments, leaving sailors gasping for breath. Another spoke of it as though it were a thief, silent and unseen, that crept into houses at night and stole away lives before dawn. Such imagery reveals the depth of terror, for the sweat was not merely an illness but a presence, a shadow upon the spirit of the land. The fear was worsened by the uncertainty of who would be struck. Unlike plague, which often favored the poor in crowded quarters, the sweat could strike lords as easily as peasants. There was no safety in wealth. In fact, some believed that the well-fed and the powerful were more vulnerable, their bodies weakened by luxury. The tales of strong young men collapsing fed the unease. Mothers who might once have believed their sons safe in their prime years now looked upon them with anxious eyes. Over time, communities developed rituals of avoidance. When a neighbor fell ill, doors were barred and windows shut. Parish records sometimes noted not only deaths but the desertion of whole households, as servants and even relatives fled rather than risk infection. Yet this too left scars. Survivors bore the guilt of abandonment, the knowledge that loved ones had died alone. The rhythm of daily life altered. In times of outbreak, markets grew quiet. Church services were sparsely attended. Courts postponed their sittings. Marriages were delayed, baptisms hurried, and funerals multiplied. The sweat became woven into the calendar of the kingdom, a recurring guest whose arrival was dreaded but expected. And yet, curiously, after a season, the disease would vanish. It left no obvious trace, no lasting contagion. Survivors resumed their tasks, villages repopulated, and the court returned to London. But always the memory remained, a memory that could be reawakened at any rumor of renewed sickness. This cycle of sudden terror, brief devastation, and disappearance marked the character of the sweating sickness. It was as if the malady belonged not to the ordinary order of diseases, but to a realm of storms and apparitions. Just as a tempest might strike without warning and then clear, so did the sweat. And just as sailors could never be sure when the next gale might rise, so could the people of England never be sure when the sweat would come again. By the closing years of the 15th century, England was a nation both rebuilding itself from civil strife and shadowed by the uncertainty of this new plague. The Tudor Dynasty stood, but it stood under a sky that could darken at any moment. The sweat had written itself into the imagination of the people, not merely as an illness, but as a symbol of the precariousness of human life, the fragility of power, and the mystery of the forces that govern the body and the world. Thus the spreading shadow of the sweating sickness lengthened, not only in the reach of its outbreaks, but in the minds of those who lived under its threat. Every cough, every sudden weariness, every bead of unexplained sweat could awaken the memory of neighbors who had fallen. And so the people of England learned to live in a state of watchfulness, never certain whether the next dawn might bring health or the sweat. The turn of the century found the Tudor court glittering with ceremony and uneasy pride. Henry VII, now longer upon the throne than many had once expected, worked tirelessly to secure his dynasty. He arranged marriages, built alliances, and sought to enrich his treasury with careful bargains. Yet for all his care, there remained an adversary that his skill could not command. The sweating sickness lingered like a phantom in the air, always threatening to intrude upon the royal household. For a king whose claim to the throne rested upon victory in a single battle, the danger of sudden death was no mere abstraction. He knew that should he fall, unrest might follow, and rivals might rise again. Thus, every whisper of the sweat within the city filled the palace with anxiety. Courtiers who had once dressed in finery and paraded their loyalty now kept one wary eye upon their neighbors for signs of fever. A cough at a banquet or a pallid face in the audience chamber could silence conversation more swiftly than any royal command. The court had its own particular vulnerabilities. Servants lived in close quarters, sharing beds, food, and duties. Nobles crowded into halls for audiences and feasts. Visitors arrived from every corner of the realm, bringing with them not only news and gifts, but the possibility of contagion. It was within such spaces, dense with people and rich with contact, that the sweat could strike most cruelly. Records tell of courtiers who fell ill in the morning and were dead before dusk, their finery still upon them, their titles powerless against the malady. Others fled at the first sign of outbreak, withdrawing to country estates. This constant ebb and flow of the nobility altered the rhythm of government, for the business of the kingdom could not always wait upon the leisure of health. Councils met in smaller numbers. Decisions were sometimes delayed, sometimes hastened in fear that tomorrow the participants might not be alive. Henry himself developed a reputation for caution, even secrecy, in matters of personal health. He traveled with care, avoided crowded assemblies when rumor of illness spread, and relied upon trusted physicians. The image of a withdrawn and calculating king, so often noted by historians, owes something to this constant awareness of mortality. It was not only political enemies he feared, but the unseen enemy that stalked the halls of power as readily as the alleys of the poor. The queen and her children too were subject to these anxieties. A dynasty newly planted could be cut down in a season if heirs were lost to sickness. The very survival of Tudor rule depended upon the health of its young branches. Thus the sweat was not merely a matter of public health. It was a matter of dynastic security. Each outbreak threatened not only lives, but the stability of the crown. Chroniclers describe the movement of the court from place to place, seeking cleaner air and safer ground. Palaces were abandoned in haste. Carriages rumbled through the countryside, bearing nobles to secluded manors. The royal household became accustomed to sudden flights, to half-packed chambers, to prayers whispered in chapels before departure. In such moments the glitter of monarchy seemed fragile indeed, a thin veil drawn over fear. The people of London observed these flights with mixed feelings. On the one hand, they understood the desire to escape contagion. On the other hand, the departure of the king and his council left the city anxious, for who would govern if matters turned urgent? It was a reminder that the sweat did not only threaten the poor, it reshaped the very machinery of the realm. The sweat did not respect the boundaries of class or privilege. Stories spread of nobles struck down in the very midst of their duties. One tale told of a lord who collapsed during an audience with the king, his words silenced by the sudden onset of fever. Another spoke of young gentlemen of the court, healthy and vigorous, carried to burial within hours. Such tales carried weight, for they showed that no armor of birth or title could protect against the malady. In such an atmosphere, suspicion thrived. Some whispered that the sweat was a punishment for pride and luxury. Others suggested it was the result of foreign merchants who frequented the court with silks, spices, and strange wares. Still others, more fearful, hinted at curses or conspiracies, as though the disease had been sent deliberately to weaken the Tudor crown. Though such notions seem fanciful, they reveal the depth of unease that accompanied every outbreak. Meanwhile, physicians struggled to maintain authority. They prescribed remedies and wrote treatises, but they could not provide certainty. Bleeding remained a common treatment, though many doubted its value. Herbal infusions, fumigations of rooms, and careful diets were also recommended. Yet for every patient who recovered, there were many more who died, leaving survivors to wonder whether the cure had been useless or perhaps even harmful. Despite this, some patterns of survival did emerge, though they were imperfect. It was noted that those who remained quietly in bed, keeping warm and avoiding drafts, sometimes fared better than those who rose and sought exertion. A theory grew that the sweat should be allowed to complete its course, the patient kept in a state of gentle rest while the body purged itself. Such advice spread through households, becoming part of the folk wisdom of the time. Yet for every family that found hope in this regimen, another found disappointment, for the sweat was mercilessly inconsistent. The court's survival of repeated outbreaks gave shape to the Tudor image. Here was a dynasty that endured not only political conspiracies, but also the very assaults of nature. Each time Henry and his household emerged unscathed, his authority seemed almost blessed. Yet those who lived through the fear knew how precarious it truly was. The peril of the court was not only the peril of individuals, it was the peril of the entire kingdom. For in the fragility of its rulers, lay the fragility of England itself. The sweating sickness had revealed this truth in stark clarity. It was not armies nor treaties that posed the greatest threat in those years, but the unseen enemy that crept silently into chambers and struck down the mighty without warning. Thus, by the first decade of the 16th century, the sweat had become more than a malady. It was a specter woven into the politics of England. It shaped decisions, guided movements, and haunted the lives of those upon whom the fate of the realm depended. The Tudor Dynasty endured, but it endured always with the shadow of the sweat at its side. The summer dragged on. The air in Philadelphia grew heavier, hotter, and more foul with each passing day. What began as whispers of an unfamiliar fever had turned into a collective terror that now hung over the entire city. By this point, nearly every street carried the sound of silence, broken only by the creak of cartwheels hauling away the bodies of the dead, or the distant wail of grief echoing from a home where another family had been struck down. In August, when the heat had already become suffocating, families began boarding up their windows and bolting their doors. It was not to keep thieves at bay, nor to shelter against the storm, but rather to create a barrier against the invisible enemy they believed floated in the air. People whispered that the fever could seep through cracks, carried on foul breezes rising from the docks, from the swamps, or from the rotting refuse that the city had long neglected to clean. A simple gust of hot air was enough to make neighbors glance in suspicion at one another, wondering if the wind itself carried death. The city council debated whether anything could be done. They called emergency meetings, but attendance dwindled as fear spread even among officials. Those who remained argued endlessly about whether the sickness came from ships at the port, from piles of waste in the gutters, or from the immigrants who had recently arrived from the Caribbean. But beyond talk, very little action was taken. The government, still young and fragile, had no established system to deal with calamities of this scale. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens had to rely on instinct and rumor. Many began burning vinegar in shallow bowls throughout their homes, believing that the sharp scent would purify the air. Others lit fires in their fireplaces despite the unbearable heat, convinced that smoke could push away the miasma. Bundles of herbs were hung near doorways, and camphor-soaked cloths were pressed to the nose when one had to venture outside. In a time when science was still fumbling toward understanding disease, such rituals gave at least the illusion of control. But there was one truth no ritual could erase. The death carts rolled more frequently each day. They became the heartbeat of the city, a grim rhythm reminding everyone that the fever was not finished. And as the carts passed, doors stayed bolted, shutters stayed closed, and curtains stayed drawn. People hid in darkness, afraid that a single breath of tainted air could end their lives. Among the wealthy, retreat became the favored solution. Families who could afford to leave fled to the countryside, hoping the open air and wide fields would shield them. Estates along the Schuylkill River filled with temporary residents who abandoned their city homes. Horses clattered along dusty roads as coaches carried frightened citizens into the green countryside, where they believed safety could be found. But even there, rumors spread faster than riders. Farmers began turning away city visitors, afraid that refugees carried the sickness with them. Inside Philadelphia, those left behind belonged mostly to the poor, the sick, and the powerless. Laborers who relied on daily wages had no choice but to remain. Widows and orphans, already struggling to survive, were abandoned to face the fever alone. African American families, many of whom lived in crowded neighborhoods near the river, could not afford escape. They stayed, watching the city crumble around them, caught between despair and resilience. Doctors, too, faced impossible choices. Some left the city, claiming their own health was at risk. Others stayed, either out of duty or out of determination to prove their methods. One of the most vocal was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a man whose name would echo through the history of the epidemic. Rush was convinced that the disease could be fought through heroic measures. He prescribed aggressive purges and heavy doses of calomel, a mercury-based medicine. Patients were bled, sometimes repeatedly, in an attempt to release the poison from their bodies. Rush believed passionately in his method, even as others accused him of doing more harm than good. Families desperate to save loved ones turned to Rush, willing to endure the pain of his treatments if it meant a chance at survival. Some patients did recover under his care, fueling belief in his methods, but others weakened quickly, unable to withstand the bleeding and purging, and succumbed to the fever. This debate between treatment and harm would echo in future epidemics, but in Philadelphia of 1793, it was a matter of immediate personal survival. Beyond the sickbeds, life ground to a halt. Markets closed, schools shuttered, churches fell silent, their bells tolling only for the dead. Theaters went dark, taverns emptied, and even the docks grew quiet as ships avoided the cursed harbor. For a city that had recently been filled with energy and ambition, the silence was staggering. The fear reshaped daily life in strange ways. Letters were fumigated with vinegar before being opened. Coins were washed in water before being exchanged. People walked in the middle of the street to avoid brushing too close to the walls of houses, where they imagined pestilence might cling. If a neighbor coughed, even once, doors would close and conversations would end abruptly. Trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion and distance. Some citizens turned inward, retreating into prayer. Families read psalms by candlelight, begging for divine mercy. Ministers preached that the fever was a punishment sent for the sins of the city, a divine rebuke for arrogance, greed, and moral decay. Others rejected this, arguing that the fever was natural, not supernatural, and that God was not to blame for the suffering. But whether through religion or reason, nearly everyone searched for meaning in the plague. What made the fever especially cruel was its unpredictability. A man could seem well in the morning and be dead by nightfall. A woman could care for her sick child, appear untouched by the illness, and then collapse without warning. There was no clear pattern, no reliable protection. The randomness bred despair, for no wall or prayer seemed strong enough to guarantee survival. The government itself faltered. President George Washington and his cabinet fled the city, moving the machinery of the young republic to Germantown. Officials argued over whether it was right to abandon the capital, but self-preservation carried the day. Philadelphia, the proud seat of the nation's government, was left to fend for itself. For citizens trapped inside the city, it was a bitter betrayal. Yet even in this atmosphere of abandonment, small acts of courage emerged. Volunteers risked their lives to care for the sick. African American leaders such as Absalom Jones and Richard Allen organized aid, believing at first that their community might be less susceptible to the fever. They carried away bodies, nursed the dying, and provided food to households too stricken to cook. Their heroism would later be questioned by critics, but in the heat of the crisis, their efforts were invaluable. By September, the rhythm of the city had changed entirely. No longer was Philadelphia a bustling capital. Instead, it was a place of whispers, shadows, and death carts. Shutters stayed closed, candles burned low, and the air carried the heavy silence of a city in mourning. Those who remained clung to small comforts. The sight of a familiar neighbor still alive, the faint hope of a breeze that might clear the air, the possibility that tomorrow might bring relief. And yet, deep down, many feared the worst, for the fever showed no sign of weakening. It spread silently, invisibly, indifferent to prayer, wealth, or reputation. Behind shuttered windows, Philadelphia held its breath, waiting to see if dawn would bring life or death. The air of Philadelphia in that fateful year grew thick not only with heat and fear, but also with the endless tolling of bells. At first, the bells rang for the honored dead, with solemn processions and prayers. But as the epidemic deepened, their sound became relentless. They rang at dawn, they rang at noon, and they rang at night. They tolled so often that citizens began to dread the sound, for each peal meant another neighbor had fallen, another family had been broken, another life extinguished by the fever. Church sextons who once rang the bells for marriages, baptisms, or the marking of time now spent their days in ceaseless labor, their arms weary from pulling ropes that announced grief after grief. In some parishes, the bells rang almost without pause, until neighbors pleaded for silence. The tolling, they said, was worse than the fever itself, for it gnawed at the mind and reminded everyone that death was never far away. The graveyards quickly filled. The usual rites of burial could not keep pace with the number of bodies. Coffins were scarce, carpenters unable to meet the demand. Graves were dug hastily, sometimes left shallow, sometimes shared by several victims. In churchyards, the soil rose unevenly, mounded with the hurried work of exhausted grave diggers. The smell of decay drifted over the city, mixing with the stench of refuse and stagnant water. Families who once honored their dead with elaborate funerals now settled for the simplest of partings, often carried out at night, often without a minister present. This change struck the citizens deeply, for in a society that valued ritual and order, the denial of proper burial rites felt like an additional cruelty. Mothers wept not only for their lost children, but also for the fact that they could not mark the grave with flowers or prayers. Widowers buried wives in silence, returning home alone to shuttered houses. Death, once a communal experience shared with neighbors, became a solitary burden. The sound of carts creaking along cobblestone streets became as common as the tolling of bells. These carts carried the sick to makeshift hospitals or carried the dead to crowded cemeteries. Drivers wore cloths over their faces, but even these thin protections could not keep fear at bay. To watch the cart pass beneath one's window was to confront mortality directly. Parents pulled their children away from the sight, whispering prayers as the wheels rumbled past. Rumors spread like the fever itself. Some claimed that the bells summoned death, that to hear their tone too often was to invite illness into the body. Others whispered that the graveyards were cursed, that the restless spirits of the hastily buried wandered at night. By candlelight, frightened families told each other stories of ghostly figures walking the lanes, their outlines blurred by heat and fear. The line between superstition and reality blurred as exhaustion and grief eroded reason. Amid this atmosphere of dread, acts of charity still flickered like faint lights. In neighborhoods abandoned by wealthier citizens, small groups organized to tend to the sick, to deliver bread, or to carry away bodies. African American volunteers, already praised by some leaders, continued their service tirelessly, though the promise that their people might be immune proved tragically false. They too began to fall ill, their sacrifices only deepening the sorrow. Doctors and nurses grew haggard. The few hospitals available overflowed, their air foul with sweat, blood, and vomit. Patients lay on straw pallets, moaning in pain, while attendants moved among them with cloths soaked in vinegar, wiping brows and emptying basins. The heroic measures of Dr. Rush continued to spark debate. Some insisted his treatment saved lives, while others whispered that he was killing patients faster than the fever itself. Yet desperate families still lined up at his door, clinging to any hope. Clergy moved through the streets as best they could, administering last rites or whispering prayers through closed doors. Some died in service, their faith stronger than their fear. Others abandoned their posts, retreating to the countryside like so many of the wealthy. The moral fabric of the city seemed stretched to its limit. And still, the bells rang. They rang for children, they rang for merchants, they rang for mothers, fathers, and sailors. They rang for slaves and for free men, for the powerful and for the poor. The fever recognized no boundary, spared no class. Each toll was another reminder that in the face of pestilence, all stood equal. The mental toll became almost unbearable. Citizens wrote in journals of dreams haunted by bells, of hearing the sound even when none rang, of waking in the night to phantom tolls that seemed to echo from their own hearts. Sleep brought no rest, for nightmares of fever and death stalked the mind as relentlessly as the disease stalked the streets. Yet, in time, the tolling of bells became strangely numbing. People began to live with the sound, as if it were another feature of city life, like the cry of hawkers or the splash of oars on the river. It no longer shocked, it no longer startled. It became a dull background to daily survival. That acceptance, bleak as it was, marked a turning point. The fever had become a permanent presence, not a passing storm. The city adapted to its new rhythm. Food was delivered to doorsteps without contact. Water was fetched at dawn when fewer people crowded the pumps. Streets once alive with trade now hosted only silence, punctuated by the creak of carts and the toll of bells. The calendar lost its meaning, for one day felt no different from another. Only the tolls marked time, each bell a measure of lives lost. And still no end appeared. The fever burned through neighborhoods with a fury that seemed endless. Behind closed shutters, families waited. Some prayed, some despaired, some grew too weary to care. The fever was everywhere, the bells unceasing, the silence heavier than stone. Philadelphia had become a city of the dead, and yet life clung stubbornly to its edges. Mothers still sang lullabies to surviving children. Bakers still needed bread when they could. Farmers still carried produce to the city gates. Hope, faint as candlelight, refused to vanish entirely. The bells tolled on, but so did the beating of hearts that refused surrender. The city had once been proud of its energy, its crowded markets, its noisy taverns, its streets filled with carts and horses. But as the fever deepened, Philadelphia began to empty. It was not a sudden evacuation, but a slow bleeding away of people. Families packed hurried bundles, locked their doors, and set off on the roads. Some rode in carriages, others walked on foot, carrying children or leading livestock. From every quarter, the streams of humanity trickled outward, seeking safety in the countryside. At first, only the wealthy left. Politicians fled to their estates, merchants to their country houses, lawyers to villages where they had kin. They had the means to hire transport, to buy food along the road, and to secure lodging in towns less affected by disease. Their departure left gaps in the city's leadership. Shops closed, offices locked their doors, and once busy wharves grew quiet. But soon, others followed. Journeymen abandoned apprenticeships. Laborers left behind tools, and servants deserted households that could no longer promise safety. Churches that had once gathered flocks found pews empty. Markets that had once thrived on barter and coin stood barren, stalls covered in dust. Even the beggars were gone, choosing the risk of hunger in the open fields over certain danger in the city streets. The exodus left behind a haunting emptiness. Streets once clogged with traffic now echoed with silence. The few who remained walked quickly, avoiding eye contact, pulling scarves over their faces. Shuttered houses lined the lanes, their owners vanished, their gardens overgrown, their windows dark. It was said that in some neighborhoods, a person might walk a mile without seeing another soul. The bustle of a capital had been replaced by the stillness of a graveyard. The journey outward was not always safe. Roads became crowded with wagons and families, and in villages beyond the city, suspicion greeted newcomers. Rural folk, terrified that travelers carried the fever, sometimes barred their gates or refused to sell food. Inns along the highways turned away lodgers, hanging signs that no rooms were available, even when windows glowed with firelight. Refuge was not easily given. Those with wealth could press onward, bribing for shelter or buying supplies at inflated prices. The poor had fewer choices. Many camped in fields, sleeping under carts or huddling beneath trees. Mothers rocked infants in their arms through cold nights. Fathers searched ditches for water. Fear of the fever clung to them, for no one knew how far its reach extended. Did it follow the air, the clothing, the very breath of the traveler? The uncertainty meant that even in exile, peace was hard to find. Back within the city, the departure of so many left entire neighborhoods abandoned. Grass sprouted between cobblestones. Dogs roamed the streets in search of scraps. Cats slinked along empty alleys, their cries echoing in the silence. The sound of a shutter slamming in the wind could make a passerby start, as though ghosts walked the lanes. The city felt less like a living capital and more like the ruin of some ancient settlement, deserted by its people. Among those who stayed were the truly poor, who had no means to leave. Free blacks, laborers, widows, and orphans remained, bound by necessity. They endured not because they wished to, but because they had no other choice. For them, the exodus of the wealthy meant even fewer resources, even less protection. They scavenged in abandoned shops, drew water from wells long neglected, and prayed each day that their bodies would withstand the fever's reach. The exodus also altered the sounds of Philadelphia. Gone was the clamor of hammering, the cries of street vendors, the chatter of taverns, the ringing of shop bells. In their place came only the rattle of carts carrying the dead and the constant, dreadful tolling of church bells. Silence spread like its own kind of plague, making each cough, each groan, each whispered prayer more distinct. The leaders who fled did so out of fear, but also out of necessity, or so they argued. They claimed that government must be preserved, even if not within the city, yet their absence left behind a void. Citizens felt abandoned, betrayed by those who had sworn to guide them. Pamphlets circulated accusing officials of cowardice. Letters recorded bitterness toward men who made speeches in times of safety, but vanished when danger grew. And yet, not everyone left. Some physicians stayed, some clergy stayed. Ordinary men and women, bound by duty or by compassion, chose to remain with neighbors, caring for the sick, burying the dead, and carrying food through the silent streets. These were the ones who bore the heaviest burden, for in the absence of authority, they became the lifeline of the city. Their names were seldom recorded, but their deeds were the reason the city did not collapse entirely. The exodus carried another cost, less visible but just as real. With so many gone, trade faltered, debts went unpaid, and agreements lapsed. Ships avoided the wharves, fearing infection. Letters went unanswered, for the men who usually wrote them were scattered across the countryside. The pulse of commerce slowed to a trickle, and in its absence, hunger deepened. Philadelphia, once a hub of New America, became a place avoided by friend and stranger alike. In the countryside, suspicion hardened into hostility. Farmers along the Delaware spoke of city dwellers as if they were carriers of poison. Children were told not to approach wagons from the capital. In some cases, stones were thrown to drive away refugees. The fever, though born within the city, created walls, that divided town from country, neighbor from neighbor, man from man. Yet, as the weeks passed, the exodus proved incomplete. Some who fled returned, unable to survive in exile. They came back to shuttered homes and deserted streets, uncertain if they had chosen salvation or ruin. Others never returned, leaving behind empty houses that would stand as monuments to fear. By the late autumn, Philadelphia was no longer the capital it had been. It was half a city, its heart torn away by absence, its strength drained by flight. The fever remained, relentless, but now its stage was less crowded. It stalked the remaining few, claiming those too poor to leave, those too devoted to stay, and those who had no place else to go. The exodus of the living revealed more than the fear of death. It revealed the fragility of community, the thin ties that bound city to countryside, leader to citizen, neighbor to neighbor. It showed how quickly order could unravel when danger pressed close, and yet, within that unraveling, a few threads held firm. Charity persisted. Duty endured. Not all fled, not all surrendered. In that truth lay the faintest hope that one day the city would recover. By the time autumn deepened, the fever had already taken so much from Philadelphia that the city seemed unrecognizable. Houses stood vacant, their shutters nailed closed. Weeds pushed through cobblestones. The air still carried the scent of decay, though the cold winds from the river began to temper it. The worst of the heat had passed, yet the fear lingered like smoke after a fire. For even as the fever began to ebb, no one could be certain it was gone. Families that had survived with trembling relief now watched their neighbors warily. If a child coughed, if a mother staggered, suspicion immediately followed. Was it a lingering cold, or was it the beginning of the sweat, the vomit, the collapse? Fear no longer needed the fever's presence to thrive. It had grown into its own contagion. In diaries kept at the time, survivors wrote of nights haunted by the tolling of bells. Even when the bells grew quieter, their echoes remained in the mind. Men described waking from dreams where the sound carried on without pause, a ringing that followed them into waking hours. Women wrote of closing their ears with their hands, yet still hearing the dull throb of death's announcement. The memory of loss was not so easily silenced. Merchants who had fled began to return slowly. They unlocked their shops, brushed dust from their counters, and tried to resume business. Yet customers were scarce. The wharves still lay empty, ships cautious to approach. Coins passed hands reluctantly, for money itself was suspected of carrying infection. Some burned their old clothing, their bedding, even their furniture, believing the fever clung to objects. Entire households were stripped bare, families sitting on wooden floors rather than risk tainted cloth. The churches reopened, but their pews remained thinly filled. Where once whole congregations had gathered, now only a handful arrived. Ministers preached to rows of empty benches, their voices echoing through hollow spaces. Some parishioners dared not enter at all, preferring to pray alone at home, their faith unshaken but their courage worn thin. The government returned in fragments. Officials who had abandoned their posts tried to resume duties as though nothing had happened, yet the memory of their absence lingered. Citizens spoke bitterly of leaders who had fled while ordinary folk remained. Trust was not easily restored. A gap had opened between ruler and ruled, and though invisible, it was wide enough to alter the fabric of civic life. Fear shaped daily habits in subtle ways. Neighbors no longer gathered to share food in doorways. Children no longer played freely in alleys. Couples postponed marriages, parents delayed baptisms, friends declined invitations. The rhythm of community life slowed, its movements hesitant, as though every action carried the weight of risk. Even gestures of kindness grew restrained. A loaf of bread was left at a doorstep rather than handed directly. Words of comfort were spoken across distance rather than face to face. And still, some wounds could not be measured by empty pews or shuttered shops. Families broken by the fever carried their grief quietly, but the silence of mourning hung heavy over streets. Fathers who had buried wives now struggled to raise children alone. Mothers who had buried children sat in doorways, staring blankly at the empty space where laughter once filled the air. Orphans wandered, searching for relatives, clinging to strangers. These private losses were as real as the public devastation, and together they formed the true measure of the epidemic's cost. The long shadow of fear extended even beyond the city's limits. In the countryside, villagers still spoke of Philadelphia as a cursed place. Travelers from the capital were turned away, or, if allowed entry, were treated with suspicion. Trade with the city remained cautious. Farmers sold their produce at high prices, demanding extra coin for the risk of entering the streets, where the fever had once raged. Thus, even as the fever's grip loosened, its consequences lingered in the economy, in the markets, in the daily exchange of goods. Doctors debated endlessly about causes and cures. Some insisted the fever had been born from miasma, foul vapors rising from the docks and the filth of the city. Others argued it had been carried by foreigners, spread by ships arriving from the tropics. A few clung to the idea that it was divine punishment, though such voices grew softer with time. None could explain why some households survived untouched while others perished entirely. None could say why the fever struck with such fury, only to recede without warning. The mystery itself became part of the fear, for what could not be understood could not be prevented. As weeks passed, the fever's presence diminished, yet its shadow did not. The sound of carts faded, the bells fell silent, and the graveyards filled no further. But memory remained, etched deep into the minds of all who had endured. They had seen neighbors abandoned, families destroyed, leaders absent, and communities torn apart. They had learned that society's bonds, so often celebrated, were fragile indeed when tested by death. And yet, life stirred once more. The markets reopened, children cautiously returned to play, and taverns again heard the murmur of conversation. The river carried boats to and from the wharves. The ordinary rhythms of city life, though slowed, began to reappear. But beneath every laugh, beneath every exchange, lay the awareness of what had been endured. The fear had not vanished. It had merely settled into memory, waiting for the next time it might awaken. The long shadow of fear was not only a burden, it was also a lesson. It reminded the citizens that health was not guaranteed, that wealth and power offered little protection, that community could falter but also endure. It whispered of fragility, but also of resilience. The fever had passed, but its shadow stretched onward, following each survivor into the uncertain days ahead. The city of Philadelphia lingered in a haze of silence and dread, and though the passing weeks had thinned the number of daily burials, the nightmare was not yet over. By the autumn's decline, the streets, once bustling with wagons and voices, had grown weary of their own emptiness. Silence had become the city's constant companion, broken only by the tolling of church bells or the creak of funeral carts that still rolled toward Potter's Fields. For a time, there had been a fragile hope that the fever would spend itself quickly, burning through the summer heat and vanishing with the same suddenness with which it had arrived. Yet as the chill of late October and early November swept into the city, people discovered the truth with heavy hearts. The fever had not vanished completely. It lingered, faint but cruel, as though reluctant to release its grip upon the young capital of a young republic. The shadows of fear did not retreat merely because the season had changed. Families who had survived the worst weeks remained cloistered in their homes. Windows were shuttered against the outside world, as though fresh air itself were guilty of carrying death. Neighbors passed one another without greetings, hurrying on their way, their eyes cast downward. Even those who had escaped the illness carried invisible scars that would take years to fade. What had begun as a sudden calamity in the late summer had grown into something larger, something that seemed to define the spirit of the city. Philadelphia was no longer merely the site of the epidemic. It was a city of survivors and mourners, a city still trembling at the memory of unseen contagion. It is easy to forget that Philadelphia was not merely a city of merchants, artisans, and laborers. It was the beating political heart of a fragile new union. The federal government had resided there only briefly, its stay intended as temporary until the new capital could rise upon the banks of the Potomac. Yet the fever had revealed how precarious the arrangement truly was. When the first alarm sounded in August, officials had fled with startling haste. The president retreated to the countryside. Congressmen scattered to their estates in neighboring states. The Supreme Court adjourned before it ever convened. In those weeks, the seat of government ceased to exist in any functional sense, leaving Philadelphia to bear the burden alone. As November's cool winds blew through the cobblestone alleys, the absence of governance hung heavy. Who was responsible for the city's welfare? Was it the responsibility of local magistrates, who had remained but were themselves overwhelmed? Was it the duty of physicians, divided among themselves and at times more concerned with reputation than healing? Or was it the burden of volunteers, both black and white, who had risked their lives to bury the dead and comfort the sick when all others fled? The fever had asked these questions without offering answers, and the shadows it cast fell not only across Philadelphia, but across the reputation of the Republic itself. Foreign observers were quick to note the collapse of order. European newspapers whispered that America, so proud of its independence, had revealed its weakness. A plague had arrived, and the leaders had scattered like startled birds. If a simple fever could dislodge them, what then would happen when confronted by war, famine, or rebellion? Such criticisms were not entirely fair, and yet they carried a sting of truth. The epidemic had stripped bare the frailty of institutions still in their infancy. The government was as fragile as the city, as susceptible to collapse as any household struck by grief. The experiment of liberty and self-rule, so boldly proclaimed less than 2 decades earlier, now seemed more delicate than ever. For ordinary citizens, the departure of the government had been both a betrayal and a relief. On the one hand, many resented the flight of officials who should have embodied courage. On the other, few could blame them entirely, for what man would willingly remain in a city where death lurked invisibly in the air? And yet, in their absence, it was the poor, the volunteers, the undertakers, and the clergy who had shouldered the burden. It was they who had proven resilient while the mighty retreated. As autumn gave way to the first frost, another shadow emerged. It was the shadow of memory. Survivors found themselves haunted not only by what they had endured, but by what they had witnessed. Children awoke in the night, convinced they still heard the cries of the sick. Widows sat in silence, staring at the chairs where husbands once Saturday. Orphans wandered the streets, confused by the sudden absence of parents and kin. These wounds would not heal with the passing of the fever, for they were etched into memory itself. There was also the question of blame. Throughout the months of terror, accusations had flown like sparks from a fire. Some blamed the miasma, the foul air rising from the docks. Others accused foreign ships of introducing the contagion. Still others whispered of conspiracies, of deliberate poisonings. of divine punishment for the sins of a city too enamored with commerce and wealth. Even as the fever waned, these suspicions lingered, festering like unhealed wounds. No less severe was the question of race. The black community of Philadelphia had risen to an extraordinary role during the crisis, answering the call of physician Benjamin Rush, who believed them less susceptible to the fever. They had nursed the sick, buried the dead, and performed the tasks others had fled. And yet, when the fever receded, slander followed. Newspapers accused them of profiteering, of exploiting the suffering for personal gain. Such accusations were cruel and largely unfounded, and they sowed bitterness in hearts already strained by grief. In this way, the fever left not only graves behind it, but divisions. It fractured trust between races, between classes, between leaders and the people they governed. Its shadow was longer than the epidemic itself, stretching into the very fabric of the young republic's identity. There were, of course, glimmers of light amidst the gloom. Some found in the epidemic a lesson in charity, a call to renew their faith and their sense of community. Churches that had stood empty during the worst weeks now filled again with cautious worshipers. Families who had survived intact gave thanks with a fervor they had never before known. And in the quiet aftermath, a few voices began to call for reform, for better preparation, for institutions that might prevent such calamities in the future. Yet such voices were faint, almost lost in the echo of bells that had tolled too often. For most, the desire was simply to forget, to return to normal life, to sweep away the memory as one might sweep dust from the threshold. But memories are not so easily banished. They linger, like shadows in the corner of a room, waiting for the light to dim. And so Philadelphia emerged from the fever, like a survivor from a shipwreck, clinging to life, but scarred, shivering, and forever changed. The streets filled once more with wagons and voices, yet an invisible weight hung over them, a reminder that the city was not invincible, that the republic itself was vulnerable, that death could arrive unbidden, and scatter all certainty like leaves in the wind. The epidemic was no longer raging, but its shadow remained. It remained in the empty houses, in the overgrown churchyards, in the silences between conversations, and in the lingering distrust of neighbor toward neighbor. It was a shadow that would not vanish quickly, for it had woven itself into the story of the city and into the story of the nation that was still finding its place in the world. The fever had struck, and the fever had passed. But the shadow it cast remained, and for years afterward, whenever the summer air grew heavy and the smell of the docks rose in the heat, people of Philadelphia would feel a chill, remembering. And in that remembering, they would live always with the knowledge that the republic was fragile, that life was uncertain, and that even in the proudest capital of a young nation, fear could silence the bravest voices. The shadow of the yellow fever lingered, darkening not only the city, but the legacy of a time when death walked openly through the streets, and when survival itself became a kind of quiet, weary triumph.